We are final year history students at the University of Reading on placement at the Museum of English Rural Life.
We have been cataloguing a collection of 1970s university posters from the university's archives. Among these, we discovered a selection of posters concerning protests.
The 1960s and 70s were notable for the rise and spread of student movements across the globe. However, student protests in UK universities has received little attention compared to those in the US.
We have interviewed Professor Matt Worley to get a greater understanding of student protest movements during the 60s and 70s.
The rise of student protests in Britain were caused by a number of factors, really kind of unravelling after the Second World War. So you've got a kind of coming to terms with what had happened in 1939-45 and the whole kind of ramifications of the war, the establishment of a welfare state which allows for greater social mobility, full employment, welfare, a state protecting people. You've got a generational boom, an increase in the population of young people, which causes generational tensions between the parents who went into the war and this new generation who were born out of it. And then you've got just the whole kind of context of the time, the geopolitical context of the time, the bomb, the Cold War, education becoming more open to all, and these kind of factors all kind of come with consumption as well, consumerism expanding to create kind of new kind of identities born around consumption, youth cultures, all kind of coming together to make a kind of perfect kind of storm really for student protest. I think the university campus was a receptive climate because it concentrated people in a single space, or people of a similar age with similar experiences. I mean, things are opening up, so social mobility means there's kind of class interactions going on that perhaps wouldn't have been so much of 30 years before. It's this space where people are allowed to think critically and experiment and have ideas and discuss, and so it's really kind of a perfect environment really for protest to manifest itself. Well, the kinds of issues that were kind of being protested about varied. On one level there's a real geopolitical thing where people are looking across the world, Vietnam being the most obvious, but there's also the Chilean Revolution, which the left in Britain get very excited about and start dressing up in kind of South American guerrilla clothing and stuff like that, and imagining themselves with rifles and machine guns running down the Strand and things like that. Domestic issues often revolved around questions of identity, whether racial, sexual or gendered. And then with students themselves there's also the questions of control over the space that they're in, so that's where there's a kind of tension between the NUS and more radical student organisations which were forming at the time, trying to almost take autonomy for themselves over the campus and control the campus for themselves.
There is a long history of student activists taking action and shaping the world of politics, particularly on international issues. National liberation struggles were fought fiercely by students, often with an element of radicalism or revolution. Among the protest posters in the collection from Reading University, we have found some examples of protests on international issues.
On January the 23rd, 1963, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, or PAIGC, started the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence from Portuguese control. The Portuguese military failed to take the party seriously, and independence was only granted on the 10th of September 1974. On Monday the 5th of June 1972, the University of Reading held a meeting in which PAIGC leader Gil Fernandes spoke on the armed struggle in Guinea, shown in this poster. Gil Fernandes was a member of the PAIGC Revolutionary Council and was tasked with the role of speaking to students and those sympathetic to his cause in universities. At this time, the struggle was still raging for independence, showing that students at Reading were keen to be involved in protesting Portuguese colonialism. In the next poster, it can be seen that on Thursday the 22nd of February 1973 at 8 p.m, a speaker from the Committee for Freedom in Mozambique, Angola and Guinea visited the university to discuss the work of Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar Lopes da Costa Cabral was a Bissau-Guinean and Cape Verdean revolutionary and political organiser. He was the figurehead for the PAIGC's guerrilla movement and was assassinated on the 20th of January 1973. This talk was held less than a month later, highlighting Reading University's strong involvement with international issues throughout the early 1970s.
Other interesting posters we uncovered showed the university's involvement in the international campaign for the support of Chilean resistance. In 1970, Salvador Allende became the first Marxist ever elected president of a democratic state. In 1973, however, he was overthrown by a US-backed military coup, which was characterised by human rights abuses. The events resonated across the Atlantic and provoked outrage amongst left-leaning and Marxist individuals, particularly in the UK. A Chile solidarity campaign was immediately established in Britain with the intent to influence the British government to distance itself from the military regime. Many cultural events were organised in support. We know that, for example, the film When the People Awake was shown at Reading University. This was a film produced in 1973 about the economic disparity between the Chilean elite and mine workers, which led to Allende and his socialist government's election. There were also mass demonstrations and marches. As early as October 1973, the Academics for Chile was also founded, and in a few months they had contacts in 60 British institutions for higher education. One of our posters shows that Robin Blackburn, a British historian and later an editor of the New Left Review, came to Reading University as part of the International Marxist Group to present on the Chilean coup.
Despite some examples of protests over large-scale international causes, the prime motive behind British university protests at this time was actually student representation. In the 1970s, there was a shift in focus within the student communities to more domestic issues. Confidence in the possibility of large-scale change from below waned, and student protests turned away from global problems. By the early 70s, the growing world economic crisis was causing cutbacks in spending on higher education. Rising inflation reduced the value of student grants, and student involvement in their unions became more prominent. Students increasingly protested issues such as student representation, grants, fees, and better accommodation.
The University of Reading made national headlines in the 1970s, dubbed the union which refused to lie down. The government made changes to the way universities were funded. They would no longer subsidise expansions to halls and accommodation, but maintain pressure for universities to take larger number of students year on year. This resulted in an increase to halls fees paid by students, while loans remained unchanged. The move was vastly unpopular from the start, and students at Reading opted to boycott paying their fees. As part of this, students staged a sit-in at the administrative building, White Knight's House, to deter other students from going in to pay their fees and to get their message across to staff. As part of a national campaign, the NUS approved a series of sit-ins, and universities across the country acted cooperatively to oppose fees. In Reading, in 1973, it's estimated that around 80% of students refused to pay their fees during the first few weeks. The university decided to charge some students for fines for damages during the sit-in. 14 students were picked out. The disciplinary action made headlines as the Vice-Chancellor at the time was involved in ending the sit-ins and ejecting students, as well as being on the disciplinary board. A student newspaper, The Agitator, said that he was acting as judge, jury and executioner. The 14 students received national support from the NUS, and many other individual students' unions left messages of support, saying they refused to accept students being singled out. In June, students from all around the country descended on Reading's campus to show support and send their message of unison to the staff. Ultimately, the movement succeeded in getting a £20 increase to student loans. Although this barely covered the additional charges at Reading, and many other universities had increased their charges by substantially more.
The domestic concerns of the 1970s are reflected in the concerns of today. You could say that there is now an even greater need for student action, for today's students have more to protest against.
Issues today include student fees, accommodation costs, grants, NUS, and in Reading, PASS, a change to the administrative structure that was implemented here at Reading. It meant a reduction in staff and the closure of several departments.
When PASS was proposed, many students, including some of us, gathered outside of meetings to protest. The campus-wide movement resulted in the Vice-Chancellor receiving a vote of no confidence from staff. However, PASS was still approved, and the university is in the process of making changes.
While protests today are different from those in the 70s, using social media instead of the posters, newspapers and flyers we've been looking at, the concerns are the same. Our right to having a say in our education remains a key focus. There are certainly no signs of student politics and activism fading out anytime soon.